Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my next video in my history series for my students. Today we're going to talk about Louis Riel and the Métis Rebellion, sometimes referred to as the Northwest Rebellions. First, let's take a look at how the Métis Nation got its start. It began during the fur trade. Because of constant contact between English and French forts and nearby indigenous bands. In order to formalize relations and maintain trade between European traders and their indigenous partners, First Nations women were often married to European men who would then become part of their wives' indigenous clans. The French called this enfants du pays, which comes from a First Nations tradition called the custom of the country, where relationships of all kinds, whether it's trading, whether it's territorial expansion, whether it's war alliances, would be formalized through marriages between the different groups coming together to ally with each other. Originally, the Métis Nation were comprised of children born to French Catholic men and Cree, Ojibwe, or Dakota women. They were sometimes called bois brûlés or burnt wood. This is not a racist term. It sounds like a racist term, but it has nothing to do with skin color. The concept of burnt wood actually comes from a traditional indigenous practice for some groups of heat treating wood in order to make things like lodges and canoes and other structures more sturdy and durable, much in the same way that today we heat treat metal or rubber in order to make it stronger or more resistant. Later, the Métis also came to include children of English Protestant men who were born to Cree or Dene women. They were originally called half-breeds or country-born, and this was a racist term. Usually used by the French descendant Métis. French Métis considered themselves the true Métis, the original Métis, and at first English Métis were considered a lower class, a lower caste version of the true French Métis. But over time, this changed, and Métis were just Métis. They were just one unified nation, regardless of whether their ancestry was English or French. The Red River settlement is generally where the Métis got their start. It's the ancestral home of several Ojibwe and Cree tribes, and is the area where the city of Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada now stands. It was originally a trade post called Fort Rouge, which was established by a French explorer named La Vérendrye back in 1738. And then in 1812, further European settlement moved into the area from the east, led by a gentleman named Lord Selkirk. Over time, the Métis quickly outnumbered both pure-blood French, pure-blood English, and pure-blood indigenous people living in the area. By 1870, 80% of the population was Métis. One of the most highly prized goods in this region was pemmican, which was dried bison meat, often mixed with fat and some kind of berry. It was prized because it lasted, it preserved well. This was back in the day before there was refrigeration. So dried bison meat mixed with fat and berry held well through the winter months when food were scarce. They would build up a surplus in the warmer months, and then in the winter months, this excess could be traded or sold or given out to help other people get through the winters. The Métis flag, just a quick note on that, as you can see, it's an infinity symbol, often seen on a field of blue, but it might also be seen on a field of red. At one point, the two colors, there was a symbolism between the two different colors, but these days, not so much. The idea of the infinity symbol, as you can see, it's essentially two circles joined together at the middle. So there's two meanings here. The joining of two cultures, the circles being European and indigenous cultures coming together, and the concept that the Métis Nation will last forever. Now let's get into the man himself, Louis Riel. Riel was born in 1844 and he died in 1885. He was an advocate of Métis rights and cultural identity, and he's also seen as the father of the Canadian province of Manitoba. He approved the execution of a man named Thomas Scott, who was a Hudson Bay Company supporter with very strong anti-French, anti-Catholic views, not a fan of the Métis, and not a fan of Riel in particular. After several years in exile in the United States, Riel returned to Canada to help try and establish a Métis Bill of Rights, which failed, led to violence and an escalation of this conflict between the Métis and the Canadian government. He eventually surrendered to the government after a battle at a site called Batoche and was tried on charges of high treason. He was convicted of those charges and then hanged in Regina in November 1885. All this began with the sale of Rupert's Land, which was an area that covered most of the region around modern Hudson Bay, and it was owned by the Hudson Bay Company before the Dominion of Canada was founded in 1867. The sale was an agreement between the Hudson Bay Company and Canada to sell much of this area back to the government. John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, negotiated the sale for just 300,000 British pounds, which was approximately $450,000 Canadian at the time. The Hudson Bay Company, as part of the agreement, kept about 20% of the farmland they originally owned, as well as some land around its various trading posts that they continued to operate after the sale. As is a common theme, as we'll see in Canadian history, at no time were First Nations of the area consulted during these negotiations. This is sadly something that happened quite often in our past here in Canada, is the fact that major changes would be made that would have an impact on Indigenous people, but Indigenous people were not actually discussed or consulted about these changes in any way. The sale of Rupert's Land officially came into effect December 1st, 1869. This led to the government sending surveyors into the Red River Valley in order to section out land for sale to those seeking to immigrate west from Ontario, Quebec, and the rest of the newly formed Canada, even though the Métis and other people were already living on these lands. Riel, among others, did not approve of this, and they stood in protest against the survey teams. The survey teams refused to leave the farmland of Métis residents, insisting that they were there on behalf of the government. They had every legal right to be there, but eventually Riel and his supporters prevailed and drove the surveyors back to Ottawa. Riel and his people then took over Fort Garry from the Hudson Bay Company on November 2nd, 1869, and used it as a base to establish their own provisional government. Now, support for the committee, the Métis Committee, the new government, was not unanimous, and it resulted in the beating and capture of a Métis man named Norbert Parisian by a bunch of English Protestant men who were not fans of the Métis at all. After Parisian escaped these English Protestant men, he was tracked down and killed by several of them after he accidentally shot a English supporter of the Métis who was named John Sutherland. Basically, Parisian was running away. He found a weapon. John Sutherland came across him, and in a panic, Parisian shot Sutherland. Then his captors caught up with him and beat him to death on the spot when they found Sutherland lying dead. On February 19, 1870, Thomas Scott, who again was a Protestant with very strong prejudices against French and Catholics, was arrested along with several others while approaching Fort Garry and were seen by mate the Riel and his men. 3 men, including Scott, were then tried and sentenced to death on charges of treason for this act, this killing of Norbert Parisian. Scott died by firing squad on March 4th of that year, while Riel decided to pardon the other 2 men and allow them to go free. Now, in May 1870, the Canadian government overwhelmingly agreed to make Manitoba the 5th province of Canada. And this gave Manitoba residents the right to elect a self-governing provincial legislator and representatives to Ottawa. It was Prime Minister Macdonald's hope that by giving the people the ability to elect their own provincial government, Riel would be ousted out of power and would be forced to give up Fort Garry. It did not work out that way. Manitoba's also been called the postage stamp province because, as you can see from the map, the area was originally just this tiny square around the Red River Valley leading up to the U.S. border. Part of the Manitoba Act allowed for multi-denominational church-run schools. So you could have a Catholic-run school, a Protestant-run school, an Anglican-run school in the area without any kind of conflict. And it also allowed for official bilingualism. So French and English would be freely spoken within the new province. It also set aside 1.4 million acres of land for existing Métis and country-born families to claim on the condition that they gave up any indigenous claims to those lands. The land was provided in the form of scrips. Each scrip had a number on it, and this indicated the amount of land that they would be entitled to if they agreed to give up their traditional land. So there's an example of a scrip here on the screen, and as you can tell by the number, this would have been exchangeable for 160 acres of land. The problem is giving up indigenous land meant that that would shorten the legally allowed area for indigenous people to hunt and fish and trap and all that, because that land would then be given to the government. That extra land would be given to the government, and many indigenous people would not go along with that. Even though this agreement also allowed their children to claim a predetermined area of land that the federal government would give them when they came of age and were old enough to set up their own households, start their own farms, etc. After the Manitoba Act came into effect, Macdonald decided to send troops into the Red River to forcibly reclaim Fort Garry from Riel. Even though Riel had been elected as the first premier of Manitoba, Macdonald wanted him gone. In August of 1870, these troops arrived, and Riel and other members of the Métis provisional government were forced to leave. Prime Minister Macdonald then put a bounty on Riel's head, $5,000, dead or alive, and this forced Riel to not only leave the Red River Valley, but to leave Canada entirely, and he lived in the U.S. for the next several years. While in exile, Riel continued to be elected as a member of Parliament for Manitoba on several occasions, but because of safety concerns, because he was afraid of being killed or being lynched or being arrested, he never appeared in Ottawa to officially discharge his government duties as a member of Parliament, and yet continued to get reelected 3 times in total. Riel eventually returned to Canada in 1874. He showed up in St. Laurent, Saskatchewan to meet up with his old friend Gabriel Dumont and other Métis. who had been forced from the Red River Valley. Over the next year, Riel prepared to oppose the oppression of the Métis by the Macdonald government, and this included crafting a Métis Bill of Rights and forming alliances with local Indigenous chiefs, Poundmaker, Big Bear, and others. Riel petitioned the government several times to have them recognize the rights of the Métis under this new bill they created, but it kept getting turned down, passed over, and this just led to more and more hard feelings on the part of Riel and his supporters. On March 18, 1885, the Métis took control of a church in a Saskatchewan community called Batoche and cut off communication lines between Regina and Prince Albert. There was no telephone or radio at the time. Messages were essentially delivered back and forth on horseback, so that was what they did. They blocked anyone trying to pass messages back and forth between Regina and Prince Albert, which would eventually make their way back to Ottawa. On March 26, the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police engaged a group of Métis at a place called Duck Lake. The Métis had gone there searching for food and supplies. The battle did not go well for the Mounties. They were repelled after 12 of their men were killed, where only 5 of the Métis present at the time were killed. The Métis actions at Duck Lake then inspired other First Nations communities in the West to rebel and take similar actions in order to oppose the federal government. Now, this is a quote from Chief Poundmaker, one of Riel's allies at the time. His indigenous name was Petokahana Piwin, and he says, "This is our land. It isn't a piece of pemmican to be cut off and given in little pieces back to us," which is essentially how the reserve system was set up, right? Indigenous lands were forcibly taken, and sections of it were given back in the form of reserves. The final conflict of the Métis Rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion, happened at Batoche, and this took place May 9, 1885. After the Mounties' defeat at Duck Lake, the government sent a force of 850 militia soldiers, most of them from Winnipeg, to the area using the nearly completed Canadian Pacific Railway. The Métis were seriously low on ammunition. Anything, nails, screws, fence palings, anything they could melt down and turn into bullets, they tried to in order to use in their own defense. After just 3 days and several casualties, 8 Mounties were killed, 51 Métis, as well as numerous injuries. The battle and the rebellion as a whole ended. 3 days after the defeat, Riel decided, for the sake of his people, to surrender to the authorities, at which point his friend Gabriel Demont and other Métis then fled to the U.S. in self-imposed exile, just as Riel had done. Now, as for Riel's trial, he was charged with high treason on July 6, 1885, and was held in prison in Regina for about 3 weeks until his trial started on July 28th. There were 35 English jurors summoned and 1 French juror summoned, from which 6 jurors were to be selected for the trial. The French person didn't make it. Rumors are that French individual, because he would have likely supported Riel, who was also French descent, was threatened or coerced into not appearing. There was also only 1 Roman Catholic included in the 35 English jurors, and he too was excluded because, again, his faith matched up with Riel's as opposed to the other 34 English jurors who were all Protestant. During the trial, Riel's defense team wanted to claim that he was not responsible by reason of insanity. While he was in exile, Riel spent a bit of time in an asylum in Montreal. But Riel objected to this, believing that he was innocent not because of some illness, but because his actions were justified. He believed in what he was doing and felt he should be acquitted on that basis. In the end, Riel faced the prosecutor, the judge, and 6 English Protestant jurors. The trial ran for 5 days, and after just 30 minutes of deliberating, the jury declared Riel to be guilty. And while the jury requested leniency in the sentence on behalf of Riel, the judge decided that no, he was going to receive the maximum and would be sentenced to death by hanging. There were several legal and political appeals, but in the end the verdict stood, and Riel was finally executed on November 16, 1885. Following the rebellions of 1870 and 1885, Canada's Métis were forced into a very nomadic existence. They had no land, no community they could call their own, and were effectively refugees within their own country. Many did what they could to survive, traveling the country in small groups, sometimes in horse-drawn carriages like the one you see pictured. They farmed, hunted on whatever land they could find, but were often driven away as more and more European immigrants moved into the West. Some Métis took refuge in the communities of other First Nations groups. Often they were not allowed to stay for long. These other Indigenous groups would invite them in, allow them a chance to sleep, rest, maybe provide them with some food, but out of fear that harboring Métis rebels would bring trouble from the government, the Mounties, they were usually not allowed to stay on other Indigenous reserves for very long. They were also denied access to federal support and other services that other Indigenous people were entitled to. Some who appeared very white, like Riel, chose to pass as pure European in order to overcome these disadvantages and would move into larger cities like Winnipeg or Regina or back east into Toronto, and would just take up whatever work they could find and just pretend to be pure white. The first Métis Rights Collective was established in 1937 in Saskatchewan, and over the next few decades other Métis rights groups appeared in various other provinces. The Métis were finally given all rights and recognitions as their own nation by the Trudeau government. That's Pierre Elliott Trudeau, not Justin Trudeau, who is the current Canadian Prime Minister. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was Justin's dad in the 1980s. Changes were made to the British North America Act, which is now called the Constitution Act, and again that legally named the Métis as their own individual nation with all the rights and ability to claim status, etc. So all voting and all the other rights afforded by other Indigenous groups in the country. And again, this happened in 1982, so almost 100 years after the end of rebellions. That's how long it took for the Métis to finally reclaim their footing and to stop living as second-class citizens within their own borders. Now, the effort to exonerate Riel was a very long and complicated road. Just to make it clear, there is a difference between pardoning someone from a crime and exonerating them. If you pardon someone from a crime, if you commit a crime, usually that means, say, you might not be able to travel into the United States, or you may not be able to get certain jobs because you have a criminal record. So if you pardon someone from a crime, that basically means, okay, you've committed this crime, you've been convicted, but you know what? We forgive you. And a pardon will usually allow you to get back some of those privileges you lost as a convicted criminal. Like, you can now travel into other countries and come back freely. You can, get employment in occupations you wouldn't normally be able to get as a convicted criminal. Exonerating, however, means you should never have been convicted of that crime in the first place. Being convicted was a miscarriage of justice, and exonerating essentially takes all record of the crime off your record. It legally means you were never convicted of the crime, you never should have been charged with it in the first place. It just completely comes off your record. So that was what a lot of people started to do for Riel in the 90s, was to take back this idea that he was a traitor. And it was basically something that never should have happened and should just be wiped from history, period, at least legally. This was first attempted in 1994 by an MP for the Bloc Quebec Party named Suzanne Tremblay. But at the time, Quebec was trying to pass a referendum that would allow it to separate from Canada and become its own country. So the effort to get Riel exonerated was seen as some kind of political stunt, and an attempt to get support for this separation movement. Other attempts were made through various bills put forward by other provinces and other politicians between 1996 and 2004. Finally, Manitoba passed a bill that exonerated Louis Riel and established Louis Riel Day as an annual provincial holiday. The first Louis Riel Day was February 18, 2008, and since then it has become a provincial holiday on every third Monday in February. Other areas of the country also have a provincial holiday, a stat holiday, on the third Monday of February, but for many of those other provinces it's called Family Day. Eventually, though, other provinces have followed suit and have established their own Louis Riel Day, many of them actually on the anniversary of his execution in November instead of February. Okay, so that is it for Louis Riel and the Rebellions. There's plenty of information out there if you want to learn more about the man and the details of what happened, not to mention other figures that appear in this story, like Gabrielle Dumont and Chiefs Poundmaker and Big Bear. So I certainly welcome you to look into that a little bit further. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and we will talk to you again for the next one. Thanks.